It's great to see you all here. We're really excited with the turnout for this, our first event of the Result Governance PIC. So thank you all for coming. My name is Alvin Warren. I am the chair of the Result Governance PIC. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, and I'm a member of the mid-career MPA class of 2013. Tonight we have the opportunity to hear from this really phenomenal panel of experts about the looming fiscal cliff. And I know everybody in this room has been watching on the news and hearing on the radio and hearing conversations and seeing this over social media. This is one of the most pressing challenges facing the United States, and as we all know, it has implications for the globe as a whole. And while this topic is all over the news, we actually don't really hear very much about how these tax increases and budget cuts, which by one estimate are going to cause deep automatic cuts in at least 1,000 different governmental programs, how these are going to impact state, tribal, and city governments, and also how it's going to impact the resources and the services that their constituents depend upon. This challenge illustrates perfectly why a group of us over the summer decided to form the Kennedy School's first student organization, professional interest council focused on state, tribal, and local governments. In our experience, it's these levels of government that have the most direct and immediate impact on people's lives, and also that provide great opportunities for innovation. So through this PIC, one of the things that we do hope to do is to draw and create greater emphasis on this area of governance, and particularly on encouraging the Kennedy School to better prepare and support public leaders to serve in these capacities. Now, first, I want to thank all of my colleagues here, and I'm going to do this with all the members of our PIC. Please stand, just to get recognized. You each get an additional pretzel. They'll be coming up in a little while. I want to thank you all for your hard work in creating the PIC and for organizing this great event. Since we set out to create this group, we've been fortunate to have the support of several of the centers here on campus, and they are also our co-sponsors for this first event. So I want to publicly recognize the Center for Public Leadership, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, the Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston, and the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. We really do appreciate their support for us and for this event. We also want to thank each of our panelists. They have come from near and far. Is that you, Karen?
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
So we've had some folks come from, downstairs. And then we've had somebody come all the way from Minnesota despite fog on the runway, and you got here. Thank you for coming. Welcome. So we really do thank you for taking your valuable time to share your insights and your recommendations with us. Finally, we've been very lucky to have the strong support of one individual in particular, and he is sitting to my left, Professor David King, who we are honored to have moderate this panel. Professor King is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also the faculty chair of the MPA programs. He chairs Harvard's program for newly elected members of the U.S. Congress, and he also chairs Harvard's executive program for leaders in state and local government. He joined the faculty in 1992 and lectures on legislatures, political parties, and interest groups. He has been an absolute force in helping us to create this PIC, so please join me in thanking and welcoming Professor King.
Well, it's about time that we had a group around here paying attention to state, tribal, and local groups. And thank you for creating this PIC, and it is going to be around for a very long time. Thank you for everyone who is coming in out of your time. There's so much going on in Cambridge these days, and we're very glad that you've chosen this time. It's really a crucial moment in Washington. Of course, we always say that, but this time it is absolutely crucial. We're in the crunch of this 6-week lame duck session, and a lot of work needs to get done during the lame duck session. The session began on November 13th. On December 31st, 4 things happened. The Bush-era tax cuts expire. All emergency unemployment benefits end. The payroll tax holiday will end. And the alternative minimum tax exemptions will end. Lame duck again ends on the 1st of January, and when you wake up on the 2nd of January 2013, the sequestration takes effect. It's $55 billion in mandatory cuts in defense spending and $55 billion in mandatory cuts for non-defense spending. Over the 10-year period, this is supposed to save us $1.2 trillion. It may or may not. We'll see how long this new budget agreement actually lasts. Whether we go off the fiscal cliff or not, as the year turns, state, local, tribal governments are in tremendous fiscal disrepair. It's a very hard environment. The money is going away, most likely, and certainly the powers and authority of the national government, much of that is devolving to local control. So the hard work of government is being done, much of the hard work of government is being done in your counties, in your cities, in the tribal governments. And it's going to be an ever harder job, even if we manage to somehow avoid this fiscal cliff. You have a terrific panel here today, and we're going to go in order that they're sitting to my left. Professor Bilmes is going to have to leave at 5:30, so we want to get her in as quickly as humanly possible. I'd like to introduce in this order. Professor Bilmes is the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer here at the school. She's been with us for a good long time, having come out of the Clinton White House, where she served as Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Commerce. She also ran the census, the entire census in 2000, which is pretty remarkable. She's currently on the U.S. National Park System Board and U.S. Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Advisory Board. She's written numerous books, including the bestseller, The $3 Trillion War, which is the true cost of the Iraq conflict. Linda Forey is also familiar to many of you in the room. She represents the Commonwealth's 12th Suffolk District, including parts of Boston and Milton. And more familiar to most of you is that Linda is currently a master's degree candidate here at the Kennedy School. She chairs the House Joint Committee on Community Development and Small Business for the Massachusetts Legislature. So she has been central in spearheading major statewide initiatives to lower healthcare costs and increase capital for small businesses. Fascinating and helpful here today. Gary Moran, also no shrinking violence, certainly known around the halls of the Kennedy School, whether he wants to know it or not. He's the Senior Deputy Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, where he oversees compliance and enforcement activities agency-wide, and oversees mass DEP operations and field activities in the agency's 4 regional offices. An area that many of you all, especially environmental policy students here, have tremendous interest in. Then Jake Sullivan, a man of Boston, the Chief of Staff and Federal Relations for Boston Mayor Thomas Menino. Boy, he knows where all the bodies are buried. Some of them he presumably buried himself. And it'll be interesting to hear his perspective on how the Menino administration, how the city of Boston can survive in the rarefied air where there's just not much money coming in anymore. And joining us from Minnesota is Karen Diver. She's the chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and she's serving as the chair of the tribal governance and the CEO of the reservation's corporate and economic development boards. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. She was a Bush Leadership Fellow, which is a special program for our fellows from Minnesota, in 2002, and it's wonderful to have her back on board with us as well. I'm about to pass off this microphone to Linda, but as somebody who studies Congress, that's the main area I do is Congress, these are really crunch days. The way that money is given out through Congress is a 2-step process. First, there has to be authorizing legislation. There has to be a committee that says, this is how much we are going to spend. Authorizing bills usually last for a limited amount of period. For example, MAP 21 was the authorizing legislation for all of our highway transportation bills. It's a huge bill. It passed last June 6th. But it's only a 2-year authorization. pay attention to what authorizations are coming up. And in terms of our interests in this room, there are several that are coming up quickly. I just looked on the list. I was surprised to see that the Workplace Investment Act is up for reauthorization in 2013. And of more concern, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is also up for reauthorization in 2013. If they aren't reauthorized, the money is not going to be released unless there's an agreement under continuing resolutions. So specifically with elementary and secondary education money, chopping block, they're in some real trouble. We have to get these issues solved, or at least cope with the consequences. Please help me welcome our entire panel. And Professor Bilmes.
Thank you, David. A pleasure to be here this afternoon. I just want to say to the students who have organized this area, congratulations. This is long overdue, but it's terrific to have some focus on state and local issues here, to have more focus on this area. And I find that in teaching budgeting and public finance, of course, many of the issues that we are dealing with are global issues, really. I mean, you have very similar issues anywhere in the world if you're dealing with traffic or recycling or bicycling or laying of cable or figuring out how to provide services. And so I congratulate you on that. There is a lot that you will hear about this so-called fiscal cliff and so on and so forth. But let me just step back for a minute, because there are many people who could talk to you about those ins and outs of those particular issues, and point out that the most salient feature of this particular fiscal cliff is that this is the umpteenth fiscal crisis we have had in the past few years. We are just lurching from one crisis to another, whether it was the business over the debt ceiling last year, or the threat to shut down the government the year before, or the threat to shut down the government the year before that. It has been going on and getting worse and worse and worse over the past few years, to the point where our budgeting system as a nation has become completely dysfunctional. And among the many, I think that is pretty obvious to everyone, but one of the proof of this dysfunctionality is that the vast majority of our spending now is appropriated through so-called continuing resolutions, which are stopgap measures. And it's as if you played a whole ball game by punting, 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 and punting. I mean, you would still be in the first inning, and that's where kind of we are. But more perniciously, if that's a word, the fact is that we actually we really don't have any control over what is happening, because the spending is being cobbled together in this series of Band-Aids. So let me give you a very brief summary of what I am touting at the moment, which is my proposal for how to remedy and fix the dysfunctional budget system, and what the impact and consequences would be of that on state and local government. So first of all, the budgeting system that we have now in Congress is based on a budget which is a vast line item budget that essentially lists inputs. It lists salaries and expenses, as opposed to the kind of budget that a number of you and a number of innovative and progressive cities and countries, ranging from Sweden to Somerville, Massachusetts, have implemented, which are program-based budgets that actually look at every step in the budget process and every program and try and understand how much they cost. Now, the fact is that we actually don't know. We actually don't know how much money we're spending on almost anything. And just regarding the Pentagon budget, for example, reading from a friend of mine, Winslow Wheeler, who was for many years the chief of GAO, the chief GAO analyst for the military, he writes, "How can you responsibly save money if you don't know where it came from, where it went, and what it did when it got there? How can you affect the unending proposals to reduce overhead, bloat, waste, fraud, and abuse if you don't know where it is, how much of it is there, or even what it is?" And the fact is that, just as one example, the Pentagon, which really does not have visibility, as they put it, over where their money is spent, has not managed to even be audited for the 20 years since auditing has been required. Not that it can't pass an audit, but it's not even far enough down the path of visibility for an audit to take place. I would immediately begin what would be a 4 to 5 year process towards transforming the federal budget into a program-based budget so that we were able to actually look at where the sort of fat is and where the muscle is in order to be able to get a grip on where money is spent. Secondly, the budget process itself in Congress is now an annual process whereby all discretionary spending, which is the military and other non-entitlement type spending, is revisited in theory every year. Now, in fact, what that means is that thousands and thousands of people spend their entire year preparing very detailed analyses and descriptions of their programs. Thousands more people are evaluating those programs, and all of this is essentially thrown down the toilet because it's not used at all for any kind of budget decisions. All of the budgeting is being made essentially by giving agencies what they had last year, plus or minus a little bit that's made based on totally extraneous political horse trading type of factors. In addition, a number of my colleagues, including Jeff Liebman here, have studied how much of annual spending happens in the last 2 weeks of the fiscal year, which turns out to be A, a considerable amount of spending, and B, the most wasteful, lowest value type of spending that happens in the year. So one of the sort of most obvious fixes, which a number of states and cities and countries have gone to, is to adopt a multi-year budgeting system. I think a good start would be to start with a 2-year budgeting system. This is what the Department of Veterans Affairs, who I have worked with for a number of years, successfully argued that it could implement in order to not disrupt its hospital operations for wounded warriors. But there are thousands of programs, whether it's the National Weather Service or the Patent Service or the National Parks or many, many other programs that could also benefit from having a longer time period in which to plan. And coupled with that would have to be the restoration of budget discipline, which would mean I would limit continuing resolutions to one per 2-year cycle, and the prolific use of so-called emergency money, which is supposed to be for actual emergencies like hurricanes, but has been used to cover all kinds of expenses, should be disallowed. The third reform, which is somewhat related to what David said before, is that the overwhelming complexity of the budgeting process in Congress. The system in which there needs to be a 2-step process of authorizing for entitlement programs and appropriating essentially for discretionary programs has long since outlived its usefulness. And the system that is been overlaid on top of that has been a process of budget committees, which have essentially failed. The Senate has not produced a budget in the past 3 years. I mean, I would blow up the system, radically simplify it, reduce the number of separate appropriation bills that come through, which is now 12 or 13 per year. So you essentially had about 8 subject-related areas that went through a kind of a joint authorizing and appropriating process so that it was possible to look at entitlements and discretionary funding under categories such as health care, as opposed to the unrelated categories that they are in which they are now. Now, how does this relate to state and local budgets? We could talk for hours and hours about what's happening in the states and particularly in the cities. I don't need you to tell me, you don't need me to tell you that local governments tend to go into recessions later and come out of them later. So they are just coming out more slowly than the rest of the country from the recession in many parts of the country. You also know that many of those who are most hard hit at the local level are those who really can least afford it. When we think about where budget cuts lie, you can see what happens. I've got 3 minutes. The budget cuts fall on the night buses, for example, that instead of coming every 20 minutes, come every 40 minutes or every 60 minutes. And who rides the night buses? The people who work at hospitals at night and, people who most need them, people who often are the least empowered in our society to change things. The question is, how can budget reforms overall benefit the service delivery model in states and localities? And I would argue that there are at least 3 ways in which major budget reform could do this. First of all, when we think about investing in the country, seriously investing in things like in infrastructure, where we can borrow for almost nothing right now and put the country back to work, or education, it's the regional and subnational governments that control the spending for that. If we had a more functional budget process over a period of years, that would lead to the ability to create a national plan, which is now essentially we don't have because of this dysfunctional budgeting to sort of allocate resources and invest. Secondly, the same transparency which would govern how money is spent would enable us to have much, much greater transparency over the relationship between state, local, and federal government. For example, right now, many states, many cities are running programs which are supposedly reimbursed by the federal government, but if you actually had transparency on where the money goes, one would find that they are not actually covering their costs. I will stop right there because David is telling me I have to. But I am delighted that you've organized this group so some of these issues can be discussed in more detail.
Thank you very much, Linda. And unfortunately, we are going to lose Linda soon, so I'll move further over in that direction. Thank you for coming here.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Representative Forey. You have an interesting perch to watch all this take place. You certainly know local government well, and the budget process in Massachusetts is more elongated than it is at the federal level. It's always this interesting moment when we wait to see whether or not the state aid dollars are going to go up or down. And it's at that moment that we decide, okay, we will fund new books or we won't fund new books. It's another kind of cobbled together strange process. I wonder if you could, but you don't have to comment on that. That's just from my point of view, I can't figure out what's happening half the time with the state budget. Wondering if how do things look from your point of view around the crisis and attending crisis on the fiscal cliff?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor King. And I want to thank the organization RSLT, Governance PIC, for putting this together and inviting me to be part of the panel, which is a great panel up here. And it was great hearing Professor Linda speak about some of the different dimensions when she talks about the program-based budgets. I think in Massachusetts, that's something we're moving towards. Obviously, we have the House Ways and Means and the Senate Ways and Means Committee looking at different budget and line items. And myself, I represent the 12th Suffolk District, which is about 40,000 people. And I have to say, when folks come to me about supporting budget line items or amendments, one of the things I ask for is the metrics, right, in terms of the data. If you have a program that's supposed to be serving low-income people, that's supposed to be putting people back to work after they finish your program, they're supposed to find a job. Where is it? How many people are graduating the program, and have they landed a position? And I think a lot of times when folks hear that from me, they're a little shocked, right? And so then we try to work with them to provide the data to say, is this program working? I'm someone who believes if the program's not working, I believe in program-based budgeting, because if the program's not working, then we need to look at alternatives. And we need to look at strengthening and supporting programs that do work and that are supporting a broad range of people. So I would say on the state level, in terms of this fiscal cliff or fiscal curb or fiscal mound, whatever people want to call it, that it will have a significant impact on the state in terms of our state federal discretionary funding. And a lot of people during the election cycle will say, we don't want government, or we need government to get out of our lives. But I can tell you, if this cut were to go ahead, that this would touch education, the environment, housing, these programs that we talk about, entitlement programs such as Head Start, right? Early education programs. So these are significant programs that would be totally affected, which will trickle down state level, but then trickle down to the people in my district. I represent parts of Boston and Milton. It's a diverse community economically, ethnically, culturally. And so we have significant people, I wouldn't say the majority, but a large number of people are low income and rely on these services. And I think it's important that we try to continue to provide those services. In terms of FEMA, Linda mentioned emergency funds that would be cut. We just dealt with Hurricane Sandy, but before that, we had the tornado that hit Western Mass. And so to have $600 million cut out of FEMA, if this were to happen, that would be a significant issue for Massachusetts. Obviously, we live on the coast. I know DEP, you're going to hear from Gary and the mayor's office. And then we'll be able to talk about some of the changes that can, these changes will have a significant impact on the people that live here. So I think that's the state level. My constituents level, I would say, to go through this fiscal cliff, you're looking at 1,500 to 2,000 possible tax increase on average on people. And I think that would be a significant problem. As chair of small business and community development in the legislature, I can tell you that we've worked with small businesses for the past 3 years, really listening to them and hearing the issues and concerns that are having impact. We did a tour, visited 15 locations around the Commonwealth. There's 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. We created new legislation and new laws that will benefit small businesses. Now, if this goes into effect, it will have a significant negative impact on them. I look at the healthcare cost. Here in Massachusetts, we're proud of that we have universal healthcare, but there was an unintended consequences on small businesses in terms of covering the staffs that they have or the employees that they have. So we created legislation that talked about alleviating some of the pressure on small businesses. The governor signed it into law. We're happy about that. But if this were to take place, again, on the federal side, it would have a significant impact on these small businesses, which are the backbone of the economy. We have 585,000 small businesses here in Massachusetts. 440,000 of them are sole proprietors. So it will be a significant impact just on that community alone, which employs the people. Even though we were going through a tough recession, it was the small businesses that kept people employed. They weren't letting people go most of the time because these folks became part of the family. They were with the company for over 10 years, and they did not want to, do away, to let that person go because they know the children and so forth. So I think that would be a significant problem. I think the other issue is that on the federal level, as they're talking, and I'm happy that conversation is taking place. I want to let you know that as an elected official here in Massachusetts, it's really an honor, and I'm proud to serve in our legislature, because even though we may have, the different parties may have differences, we tend to work cooperatively in terms of in the good of the citizens of Massachusetts. And I think that is important as well in terms of we may stand differently on an issue, but usually in the end, we are still friendly. There's not this animosity and this hatred that's taking place. And I think that's something, that has to, I'm done, right?
Yeah,
my time, I have 2 minutes. 2 minutes. He's like, done. He's like, cut it out.
No,
okay. So for me, we have a lot of work to do. This issue of the fiscal cliff on the federal level is going to have an impact on us here in Massachusetts and definitely on my constituents. But we also know legislatively, and you know this, David, that even if the fiscal cliff were to take place, that, and they were able to create legislation within 30 days to do a retroactive piece of legislation, right, a comprehensive piece of legislation, then the impact may not be as significant as well. Because obviously in the legislature, we create bills, we create laws, we create budgets that do kind of take, we do look backs, if you will, in terms of retrospective pay and so forth. So, there's a lot of work to do, and I'm happy that all of you are here. And I look forward to hearing the questions and the conversations that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm wondering what Nate Silver thinks the probabilities are. that we're actually going to go over the fiscal cliff. It would be great to have him giving us a sense for what these things look like. Politically, there are some strong reasons to think we're not going to solve this in the short term. Between now and the end of the year, the negotiations are happening in a very small room with very few people, certainly between 8 and 10 people involved in the real conversations. But then if they come up with some kind of a grand bargain, they have to try and sell it to their own caucuses. And it's not an easy sell, especially during a lame duck session. It's not a very easy sell. I think if Speaker Boehner goes out on a limb and looks at real revenue raisers, he's going to have his head handed to him by the right wing of his own party, and certainly by Eric Cantor, who's his strongest opponent and would like to be Speaker himself. Likewise, Democrats aren't willing to touch real entitlement reform, which is obvious, has to happen. If entitlements continue at the pace that they're going now, it will eat up the entire budget. I mean, you have to deal with Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Politically, my sense would be that members are going to let this take place, which means that the Bush-era tax cuts go away. Everyone's kind of screaming about what happens during sequestration. And the new Congress would then be in the position of giving people tax breaks. They would be giving people, the tax breaks that they used to have. You can cut people's taxes come mid-January because the tax increases have already gone into place. So I think politically that's a pretty sensible place to be if you're thinking about your own political butt. So I'm not terribly confident that we're going to come up with a solution in the short term. There is a bill that has a shot at getting through the lame duck session that's going to have an impact on state and local government, and that's the Marketplace Fairness Act. This would make online sales taxable at the rate in which you actually are doing the buying. So right now you go to Amazon, and unless there's a major facility in your state from Amazon, they're selling tax-free. And that sounded like a great idea when the internet was, really young, and we were trying to promote the idea that there would be internet commerce. But at this point, those internet stores are taking money away from brick and mortar stores in our states. So the Marketplace Fairness Act actually has a shot, maybe a 1 in 10 shot, but it's a real shot of becoming law during the lame duck session. All right, on to Gary Moran and a very difficult legislative environment because regulatory powers from the federal government are giving him and his agency lots of work to do, and yet also state environmental agencies have a lot of their own authority and leeway under the courts. So an interesting place for you to be in.
Thank you,
Moran.
Thank you. I want to join everyone else in commending you for establishing this particular pick. As a longtime state worker, my bias is that so much of what we talk about at the Kennedy School in terms of public policy approaches, innovative ideas, really do happen at the state, local, tribal level. And certainly commend you on your timing. The fiscal cliff has started dominating the news. I expect it will be for the next month or so. I want to give I can give a broad brush picture of some of the impacts on the state of Massachusetts as a whole, at least what we expect, while at the same time, a little more detail on Mass DEP. Like everyone else, we're in a position of sitting back and watching the negotiations play out. We really can't have much control over what's happening. Professor King's description of the political possibility of this not coming to some deal it's scary. It's already uncertain enough out there, and to think that this could extend on beyond January for a period of time would just add to the problems. That brings me to one of the major issues with the impacts of sequestration. By the time this is figured out, at the earliest, we're talking about being 1 quarter into the year. So when we get our cuts, we have to make those up within, realistically, probably about half a year, which exacerbates the impact of these cuts. We have half a year to make up the cuts, so it's basically for FY13 almost a double impact. And the professor also mentioned some of the issues with the current process, and it really is, I think somebody mentioned, completely dysfunctional. We generally launch from crisis to crisis, and it's understandable that crisis can help us make some decisions we otherwise wouldn't make. but the real impact comes on those people implementing this on the ground. It becomes more and more difficult. The idea of multi-year budgets would be fantastic. The problem is we basically at this point go from, if we're lucky, every 6 months a budget exercise where we're facing cuts, and now it's getting to be almost quarterly. So to go, Massachusetts generally, some of the things, if we just had the across-the-board sequestration cuts, we'd expect we could see cuts of about $200 million. These are very general estimates. It's out of maybe about $2.4 billion in federal grants that would be subject to sequestration. There are a number of programs that are exempt, like highway funding, which is a significant chunk of our budget. But it would impact an array of programs. It would impact veteran services, labor, workforce development and training, education, special ed, after-school learning, healthcare and human services, mental health services, immunization grants. Some of the most significantly impacted, we expect, just based on the percentage of the funding they receive, would be special education, women and infants support, low-income energy assistance. So there are going to be real impacts with these cuts. And, it would be great if the state could fill in and fill the gap, but Massachusetts, like many other states, local governments, we're facing our own problems. And in fact, you may have heard recently that we're at a point where the administration has recently announced that they would hold back on a scheduled income tax reduction. We've already stopped hiring in some agencies, and it's likely that within about a week we'll hear that we have to make additional cuts for this current fiscal year where we're getting to the halfway point. We have something called 9C, that if revenues don't come in as projected, automatic cuts go into place, and we're faced with cuts similar to the sequestration cuts. So, and that's just the impact directly on government. There are nonprofits and private entities which also will be impacted. Right. The National Institute of Health will take significant cut, and Massachusetts gets the second most grants nationwide. It'd be a $200 million cut potentially to NIH, which affects all the universities and research agencies. Department of Defense, we could see over $1 billion in defense cuts in Massachusetts. So this is sort of the broad brush impacts we expect. Now, Mass DEP, for those who don't know, we're the state's primary environmental regulatory agency. We administer the programs affecting clean water, air, management of hazardous waste sites, management of hazardous waste, solid waste recycling. We currently have about 775 people. We're funded by a range of resources. We get state operating funds. We have some trust funds, capital grants, but the portion that could be subject to sequestration are the federal grants and some additional trust dollars we receive. That basically makes up about almost a third of our budget. So, and these are all discretionary grants. So effectively, we do across-the-board cuts, which is 8.2% is what they expect for discretionary programs. Realistically, if we're partway into the year, it's more like 10, 12% cut. We think we'd be looking at the dollar figures would probably be close to $3 million on the cuts. That, as far as a percentage of our overall budget, it's not huge, 3% or so, but it's on top of things like the 9C cuts we may be facing. It could equate to anywhere to around 20, 25 people we're laying off. And we certainly expect it to impact the federal programs that we are delegated to implement. We implement federal programs having to do with air quality, Clean Water Act, hazardous waste management, leaking underground storage tanks, drinking water programs to protect the public drinking water. So again, we think about $3 million. It could be around 25 FTEs, and I think it's important that to take one quick step back. I'm talking about this in a bit of a vacuum, but you have to put it in context of what state and local governments have been through already. We've incurred, as other state agencies have, dramatic cuts over several years now, with the national economic downturn, increases in mandatory spending that we have to deal with, pensions, health care, the discretionary programs, things like environmental protection, they're being squeezed out. Certainly the case in Massachusetts. Over the past 10 years, actually, when I was in school here in 2002, we've seen our agency has gone from about 1,200 FTEs down to about 775, as I mentioned. So we've lost about a third of our staff. And our agency is primarily staff. We don't have construction grants or other things to rely upon when we're faced with cuts. We continue to see increasing reliance on the federal government. Over the past 5 years, it's just a growing number of our funds are coming from the federal government. And the situation, as I mentioned, isn't improving. In Massachusetts, we're facing the potential of 9C cuts. We're already looking at additional cuts for next year. So you potentially, by the time we get into next spring, could be facing 5% more cuts to the agency that has suffered a lot already. So it's the areas we'd expect to see some of the cuts. It's pretty much across the board. Over the years, as we've dealt with cuts, we've tried to do it in creative ways possible. We've done regulatory reforms. We just reviewed all our regulatory programs to try to come up with streamlined ways of doing business. We've tried to leverage the private sector to do more of the monitoring environmental compliance for us. We really have tried to target areas. Over those 10 years, I think we probably cut our administrative support staff from 40 to 60% compared to, for years, the compliance enforcement we maintained. But that's stopping. We're now to the point where we are cutting into critical core services. We'd expect to see things like environmental sampling to be reduced, the monitoring, assistance to municipalities and local governments, which is always one of the first things to go, unfortunately. Permitting, which we've done a good job maintaining through innovative programs, that'll stop being impacted. I think Sandy was mentioned. Our emergency response capabilities are really being stretched to the limit, and they will continue to be. I was talking with my boss today, the commissioner, and he wanted us to do more proactive planning so we can be prepared for something like Sandy. And unfortunately, there's really no place to go. We're very limited in terms of our resources. So I guess just a couple of other points. As I mentioned, there are some real-world logistical issues with these cuts. We would have to make up for FY13 a full year's cuts and maybe half a year. And we have to go to personnel. So right off the bat, you're dealing with various rules, whether personnel rules are the things which make that even more difficult to achieve. So it gets to be very difficult to make those cuts. And on top of that, the way the rules work in terms of layoffs, we're not selecting where these cuts are happening. What we're doing is we're going to the people who last joined the agency. We pretty much have got rid of all the young people in the agency. We're definitely growing, and as people retire, we can't backfill them. It's dealing with EPA on this. We annually negotiate an agreement with EPA that covers most of our programs. You would expect that when we get these cuts, where there would be some commensurate reduction in what we have to do for the federal government, and with all due respect to our colleagues at EPA, that in and of itself will take more resources, and we're likely not going to see the type of reductions we need to see in their requirements. There certainly isn't the flexibility or creativity at that level that we've been able to try to show on the federal level dealing with these budget cuts. So I hope that gives some context to what we're facing on a federal in the federal end. I have to say one thing for the students out there. Hearing these discussions today just reinforces what a great opportunity is to sit back and think about these things without the pressure of a day-to-day crisis. I think it should be a requirement that you have to come back and participate in these periodically, because it's great to hear those discussions rather than we really are on it. It's no longer, as I said, a 6-month to 6-month crisis. We're quarterly at best. We're facing another a budgetary crisis, and so it is good to hear somebody step back and think about this in a little bit more strategic way. So,
thank you. And a further plug for the students, and so that you can pass it on to other students. A lot of our Kennedy School students think that they're going to go off to D.C. and make the world a better place, so they want to join the United Nations or work for the World Bank and make the world a better place. How do you want to do that and not start at home? I mean, if you want to have a real impact on the lives of people in your community, start working in the community. I've been able to work on a policy level internationally and nationally, and one of the most meaningful things that I had a chance to take part in was in the city of Boston when I helped out with the Department of Elections after the elections in November in 2006. And for 5 months I was in City Hall. The mayor never learned my name. I was always the professor. But it was a remarkable experience, and I wouldn't trade that experience for another day in D.C. or another day in Moscow. So when you're looking for places to make real change, look at a very local level, and it's absolutely possible. Jake Sullivan's living that life, and it's difficult being in cities in Massachusetts. The counties here are not strong. And much of our funding for cities comes from property taxes. And for large cities, they also have to really depend on state aid. So in times of economic crisis, obviously your property tax base is being hit, and then you're getting hit with these cuts from state aid. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how Boston survives. It's a remarkable budgeting trick every couple of years. And Jake, how are you going to make it through this one?
Well, thank you, Professor, and I want to thank the RSLT for having us. And I'll start with, in the context of this discussion, a positive note. I want to say that the city of Boston is growing. For the 2010 census, the city of Boston is at 621,000 residents for the first time since 1970. We have the largest 20 to 34-year-old population in the country, top 5 cities. Our growth is outpacing New York and San Francisco. And the city of Boston is diverse. In 1980, close to 70% of Boston was white. We are now a majority minority city, a dynamic city that is changing and growing and has these challenges. Mayor Menino often says that, and I agree with him, that the city of Boston is the economic engine of the Northeast. We generate 20% of the tax revenue that goes to the state and receive 2% back in net state aid. So we have that challenge with property tax that we have to rely on property tax, yet 50% of our properties in Boston we are unable to tax. So we go through pilot and other creative measures to try to make up those gaps. With that being said, I think what scares us the most is sequestration. That Boston's annual budget is $2.4 billion, our operating budget. And roughly $300 million of that is through federal funds. So that may not seem like a lot in the context of the $2.4 billion, but 94% of those funds rest in 8 city departments. And they're the most important departments that operate in the city: our public schools, our public health commission, our Department of Neighborhood Development, our police department, our emergency management department, our libraries, our parks and rec, and our housing authority. So direct cuts from sequestration, 8.2%, in a short fiscal year as the current continuing resolution expires in March, are devastating to our Title I funds for our public schools, our special needs funds for our public schools, our capital funds where we rebuild public housing. 10% of Boston residents live in public housing. And if you want to see what the city does when the federal government bets on us with a grant, go down to the Old Colony Project in South Boston and look at the new green housing there, innovative green award-winning housing where 1,000 people work, 300 full-time jobs, many of them Boston residents, many of them diverse, and about 10 or 11% women working on that project. That's what we do with federal dollars. We took a $22 million grant and leveraged an additional 37 to build that project. We like to use federal funds to transform and leverage our current efforts. So a project in the heart of the Representative District, the Dorchester Avenue project from Andrew Square to Peabody Square, was funded by $12 million of federal stimulus dollars, a transformative project that we thought we could do maybe 2 or 3 years at a time. We did in one shot with great community process. So federal funds really represent a great leverager for us, and we've taken some very heavy cuts over the years. The Community Development Block Grant, we're currently at the lowest level since 1973 in Community Development Block Grant funds. We're at $15 million. What the city does with Community Block Grant dollars, because it's the last really discretionary fund you can tailor to your communities, we build affordable housing. We make loans to small businesses. If you've ever eaten at Clover restaurant here in Harvard Square, in 2010, 7 banks said no to them when they wanted to expand. They came to the city, they got a small $25,000 loan, and all of a sudden there's food trucks all over the place, bringing you Clover food. That's just one example of what the city does with these kinds of funds when the markets can't do that. So while we're very concerned about the funds that come directly to the city, and I could give you numbers on what an 8.2% cut could mean, and and how many teachers that might mean and how many students we can't serve. We're also interested in the cuts that don't come directly to us. And one of the big areas is research funding, health and research funding from NIH. Over the last 17 years, Boston and all the hospitals and great research institutions have received $23 billion worth of research dollars. And just as I was coming over here, the mayor has been really thinking about this and has been moved in his recovery and is doing well. But he was really concerned about these research dollars and the impacts on the healthcare training, the healing that this region provides. And I think we've provided a copy of a letter that he fired off to the president and Boehner about, this is my perspective now, being in an institution like this for a little while and seeing what it does for people and how great this is for the region. So, and I think they just put it up on the mayor's Facebook page as well. So if you want to check that out, it's a very different letter than he usually writes, and it's really calling for action. But we don't want to see those research dollars and the new knowledge-based economy. We don't want to take the step back, and that's what sequestration does for us right now. The low-income heating energy assistance program that ABCD runs for our region, 20,000 Bostonians, they're looking at a $9 million cut from sequestration. So those are funds that don't come directly to the city, but they're so important to the fabric of what we do. And we have often argued that these programs that have been taking these cuts, these programs that are on the chopping block, they didn't cause the budget deficit. Mm-hmm. They are not the programs that created the problems that we are in. And we've had, if you take the long view back, we've had some unplanned wars that we're paying for. We've had the largest tax breaks for the highest upper income Americans in the country over the last several years. So when you talk about a spending problem, you also have to look at a revenue problem. We've had some revenue removed from the city and from the state. So I think a successful model that we experienced was the President's Recovery Act. We received over $300 million in competitive grants, formula grants, and bond tools in 2009 to 2012 from ARA, and we put it to work. And we saved teachers' jobs, we built affordable housing, we lended to small businesses when people wouldn't, and we didn't have any gotcha stories in the paper. You didn't see a lot of press on it because the press was interested in covering the bad things. And we didn't want it being branded as a failure, as some people did, that it was a massive spending spree that had no impact. It had a lot of impact on the city, and it got us through a really difficult time. So for us, sequestration is the big one, and we don't have a seat at the table on this one. So forums like this are very important to get the message out there and raise awareness, and we appreciate all of you taking an interest in this. And we'll with 28 days or so left, the stakes are really high for a city that we believe is thriving and wants to do better for those people that are still struggling. So this kind of step back is really gonna hurt us and stop the momentum.
Thank you very much. Everything's so upbeat in here. It's all sobering stuff. My father's a Methodist minister. Dad, if you can see me on the screen over there. So one of my father's favorite bits of scripture it's a short one. Is God loves a cheerful giver. Give it all you've got. And he usually says that just before an offering. We might need to have a little offering moment in here because, ultimately we're all going to pay, either through lower services or through higher taxes. And I thought your comments about how these are the programs that are suffering, and it wasn't the fault of these programs that we're in this terrible shape. Karen, I don't know much about how tribes are handling any of this. I don't have a sense for how much money the nation is receiving. How are you thinking about this? And do you have some success stories that might give us some moments of hope?
Well, first of all, one of the reasons I was willing to brave freezing fog coming from northern Minnesota is tribal governments just got included with everything else at the Kennedy School. Woo! So thank you for that, because we are not insignificant players in our own communities and our own regions. And you're right, it's a little different. It's a lot the same and a little different in Indian country. And I'm happy to speak about that a little bit. Just by way of background, since people may not know, Fond du Lac is located due west of the city of Duluth. We actually used to own Duluth, but they wouldn't let us keep lakefront property. So now we're due west and south of Duluth, Minnesota. But as such, we're a tribe of about 4,200 people. We have about 100,000 acres as our land base that we care for. But we are the second largest employer in all of northern Minnesota. We have about 2,200 employees. We're surpassed only by the health system in our region. Our annual distributions of income, anything that hits a tax statement, is about $115 million. So we're big in terms of the economic vitality in a fairly rural part of the state. The biggest city is Duluth with about 80,000. And, it's a Rust Belt city. So we've been a significant player, and we've struggled since the recession in trying to make sure that we are making smart decisions. We are a gaming tribe. Gaming does not equal unlimited wealth. Gaming serves for most tribes as a surrogate tax base. We don't have property taxes that we collect because the land isn't really owned by our people. It's owned in common by the tribe, and they lease it. They're borrowing it. So we only have federal and state government funding available to us and some smaller levels of philanthropy unless we earn it ourselves, which is one of the reasons why gaming has been a boon to the tribe. We have tried to use our gaming funds to start other businesses to diversify our economy, but once again, in a fairly rural area of Minnesota, the whole northern half of the reservation cannot get any more landline phone service, cannot get cell phone service, and cannot get internet unless it's satellite. So we face some fairly big development challenges. Even within my little 100,000 acres, it's very different from one end. We have 2 counties, 3 cities, and 11 townships within our borders that we have to negotiate various things, provisions of services. So I'm impacted, one, by what happens to them. If they can't maintain their fire services because there's too much unemployment, they're not getting the property tax revenue back, then we're going to have less emergency services. So I'm impacted by everything everybody else is saying, whether it's at the state level to the school districts. We have our own school, but we also have 3 other school districts within our borders. So we're watching those things as well. Our earned revenue ends up being about twice as much as our grant revenue. We're still looking at some fairly significant cuts in all of the programs that you said, particularly the irony isn't lost that we're losing heating assistance as well, being in northern Minnesota. That's fairly tough. The biggest hit for us since the recession, and this is more what worries me more than 8.2% cuts. A lot of the money doesn't come to Indian country and formula. Some does, but a lot of it comes in grant pools that are competitive. So there just may be less availability. So instead of putting out, 40 grants that average about 50, 60,000, they may only do 30 or 25. My worry is that some of the tribes with less social capital and less capacity won't fare as well in that process, and those are the ones who need it most, and they will be hit the hardest. I'm also a bit worried more about the message that the government is sending the rest of the country around their responsibility at a federal level. Our revenue is still about 30% down from when the recession started in 2008. The economy has not improved to the extent where we are making the money that we did before the recession. All of this talk of fiscal cliff makes people hoard their disposable and discretionary dollars. A lot of the way I raise revenue is through discretionary and entertainment dollars. And those are the ones people don't spend when they're afraid about their own economic health. So about half of our employee base is in our corporate side, and about half is in our government side. The problem is it's the people in the corporate side that leverage and provide the matching funds for the grant side, and also provide the gaps in services. So if we don't have enough money for heating assistance, we started putting out smaller grants eligible to the same folks to help beef it up a little bit. If I can't leverage those dollars because my gaming and corporate revenue is down, then I'm also losing the matching funds. I'm keeping teachers in rural Minnesota because in Head Start, they're not in a school district. They're run by us, much like a nonprofit Head Start. I'm keeping them because I can pay for their health insurance. I may not be able to do that if I can't raise revenue on my own through my corporate enterprises. I won't have the matching dollars, the facility money that isn't usually carried in a lot of the grants. You can, get operating support and direct service dollars, but you can't always turn on the lights and pay your accountant. So those are the things that we're able to leverage within our community. A bigger worry, or as much of a worry for me, is a lot of what we fund, there isn't funding available for. We 100% fund our own police department. We're very rural. Average response time from Duluth to the north end of the reservation is 45 minutes to an hour. So I am self-funding a police department. We're also what's called a public law 280 state, meaning that other jurisdictions have criminal jurisdictions. We have civil regulatory jurisdiction. So there isn't money through the new law, Tribal Law and Order Act, to help me fund my department because other jurisdictions are supposed to be taking care of it. But because they're not, and haven't historically, we have been self-funding a police department. So if I have to start looking at making cuts, it's going to be fairly direct services that are going to be fairly impactful for a tribal population. It's also going to be a lot of the entry-level employment where I'm providing opportunities for entry into the job market for tribal members. Obviously, through Indian Health Service funding and through tribal college funding, I'm hiring fairly credentialed folks. It would be a sad day indeed if I am able to keep all of my non-native staff, which is about half of my employees, working because they have some level of credentials, but I can't put a recreation person in our community center at an entry-level wage and get them entry into the workplace so that we can encourage them to career ladder, go to the tribal college, build their skills. I got to get them into the workforce first. And still Native Americans are suffering some of the highest rates of unemployment in the country. And that never really gets any better. The recession only hurts it kind of at a deeper level because we're not self-funding it ourselves. Probably that's the biggest thing I want to say is, I read all of this and I watch it, and, the Bull-Simpson plan, it says that one of the tenets of it was that it was supposed to protect the truly disadvantaged. And when you see what's come down the pike already, whether it's heating assistance, housing dollars, Section 8 vouchers, veteran services, the initial whack is coming at a fairly irresponsible level. America has always been known for its safety net and for the services for those people who need the safety net for climb their way out of it again. And it seems like we're forgetting that. This was the time of opportunity here, that no matter where you were and how bad you had it, you were going to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And nobody expected you were going to do that all by yourself. That safety net was there for you. Sometimes you bounce in it more than one time, but you always had the opportunity to bounce back out. So I think that, for all of this talk of, left and right and everything else, I think we're forgetting our values. And our values is that, we're supposed to take care of one another. And when we do good, we're not supposed to forget the ones we've left behind. And Indian country has been left behind an awful lot. And whether it's a tax on our revenue sources and the perception that we have gaming and the Indians have something that others do not. Well, you didn't share our poverty, our out-of-home child placement rates, our lack of educational attainment, our family violence, all of those other things. So now I see these other jurisdictions wanting to dip their hands in the tribal pocketbook and think that they are deserving of something they didn't help us get. I am willing to help the surrounding community. I'm willing to do mutual aid agreements. I am willing to pay pilots in some cases, depending on the need, grants. I am willing to hire lots of people, but I am not willing to have our self-sufficiency taken away when we've finally been able to try to get little pieces of it. It's fragile. It's awful fragile. So with that.
Thank you very much. We have about 20, 25 minutes, and there's more knowledge and experience in that side of the room than there is on this side of the table, and I welcome you to approach either of the mics on either side of the room. Please tell us who you are, where you're from, and ask a question, a concise question. If you can identify who you'd like to have answer that question, that would be terrific. But, floor is open to you. Thank you.
Okay, if I assume that we're going to go over the...
But yes, tell us who you are, where you're from.
Sorry. Bill Carlson, retired. So I have lots of
But a
time.
name like Carlson, are you from Minnesota?
My parents and grandparents are from Nebraska.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think we're going to go over the cliff, and I actually think that's a good thing. But to ask a question, once we've gone over the cliff, if Congress gets to put 2% back in again, they're doing this across the board cut of 8.2%. Give me your top priority for what to fund with the 2% you're putting back in again. I mean, the great thing about downsizing is that you cut deep and then make careful decisions about what to put back in again.
You want to identify anyone you would like? Because I don't want to answer that question. So if there's anyone you identify, anyone want to take a shot at that?
I'll take Mayor Medina.
Well,
What's your address?
I would argue that we've already been cut fairly deep. And stimulus was a one-time thing for us, but 2% back, we'd want to go in education. I mean, that's the most important thing in the city. But again, I think that the programs that serve our residents and those who are most vulnerable have been asked to give enough already. And in the FY13 budget, we've already agreed to a $78 billion framework that the Senate's abided by, and the House has gone deeper with the failed vice presidential candidate Ryan. So, I mean, I think cities, I work for a city. I'd argue they're the economic engines of the country, and I think we've been asked to sacrifice enough, and we can't keep doing this and expect to thrive and drive the economy.
Anyone else want to take a shot at that? Sure. All right, and then if you're ready to ask a question, hop on up and get in line.
I think, just speaking for myself, one thing is, if we were to get 2% back, what I'd like is 2% back, and for us to be able to decide how we spend not just the 2%, but all of the money that the EPA is giving us. If they would give us broad discretion and not do a activity by activity negotiation, we could make up some of that. And we would focus on the things that we find most important, which isn't necessarily the case now. You do raise a good point. I mean, whether it's 2% back or we need the full 8%, I mean, fundamentally, what's going to happen at some point is we're going to have to look at how we're funding our programs. They may be shifting the way things are funded, but it's these fiscal crises that then they come in, we're forced to implement it within the current structure. That's what's not working. If you did have a chance to step back a little bit, say, what is the appropriate way to fund environmental protection programs? Is it through EPA? Is it through greater state funding? I'd be happy with that. The last thing is, we had a good chunk of money. Hopefully, we're getting on the state side. I'd love to put into information technology to make us more efficient and do it that way. Something we're trying to launch here in Massachusetts already.
And I would just say quickly, I would say education is definitely important, and I think in terms of Governor Patrick with the initiative in terms of the using community colleges. We have the mass life sciences here, biotechnology. Obviously, we're trying to build and strengthen that industry. The jobs that are open now, about 100,000 jobs are open, and it's in life sciences and biotech, but you don't have to have a PhD. You don't need that. And so it's really retraining people on the community college level, the state university side. So education, I think, is critical, but also programs. Again, it's bringing people to self-sufficiency. Obviously, the entitlement programs are so important and critical, but how do we move people out of poverty? So I think the education component, but also financial literacy and job training is going to be critical if we were to get that money back.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Hi, I'm Jean Deitch. I'm an MCMPA and a former entrepreneur. The thing I don't understand when I hear people from the government talk about cutting spending is that they seem to think that it's like a household budget. You've got your salary coming in, and if you cut your spending, you're going to save X amount of money. To me, it's more like a business. If you cut your spending, you're also affecting your revenues. And I never hear government people talk about the impact of spending cuts on revenues. So I would like to hear someone speak about that.
I mean, from our agency's perspective, one thing is we tried to protect during the course of these 10 years of cuts a couple of areas. One is our permitting, and because one thing is important for generating revenue for the state, but also it does bring in revenue. And the other thing is compliance and enforcement that potentially can bring in revenue, although it's not the ultimate goal of compliance and enforcement. We'd rather not be issuing penalties if possible. We'd rather have people in compliance. So, I mean, there is some attention to pay that. One interesting thing about the way, for better or worse, things are established, we don't get the revenue we're bringing in directly. We bring in much more money in terms of permitting and compliance and enforcement dollars than we get back through the state. So if we were to be off budget and be able to focus on that, there may be some benefits to that. But that isn't what happens. We have to go to the state to get their appropriation. We have to get the federal grants, and we're limited in what control we have over the revenue we do generate.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that the spending cuts take away tools that we use that are great leverages to launch. Usually, federal money that the city is able to lend or put into a project is the first brick in the building and opens up a lot of other streams to complete a development or move it down the line or get the financing that needs, which then leads to job creation, which then leads to either private development, which helps our property tax base. So losing the federal tools that we use as leverage through those cuts hurts our ability to support our small businesses and some of our developments. So that's where federal dollars are a great leverager for us. They allow us discretion on where we can put them. So losing that ability to doing more with less in that respect hurts our ability to do a lot of private development as well.
Thank you. A question over here.
Hi, Ed Frechette, mid-career. I have a couple of questions. One is, from your perspectives, all four of you as budget planners, is it better to have clarity one way or another so you can plan around it, or is it better to hold on to a little bit and it gets chipped away and you're hoping that it's going to hold on? I'm just wondering, from your perspective, would you rather say, as painful as it's going to be, I'd rather be clear so I know where I'm working with? And the other question is, I think there may be a clear economic solution, but the political situation gets in the way. And is there a way in your mind that Republicans and Democrats could both save face through this and reach a solution, or is somebody going to have to lose?
So I would say that it's better to have clarity. In the legislature, working with the House Ways and Means in terms of the budget, we obviously work on two sets, right? We work with a budget as if the money's going to be there, and we have an alternative. So there is an alternative plan where we create another budget, thinking about these certain cuts. So I think it would be great to have clarity. But sometimes it's you just have to understand that something's going to come down the pike. It's either going to remain there, the 8%, or it's not. And so it's really being proactive and trying to create the budgets to reflect that. In terms of the political side, I think, again, I think it could be a win-win for everyone. And I think the past election, with all the rhetoric that was taking place on the national stage, the election what happened in terms of the final election, I think the American people spoke in terms of the direction that they wanted this country to move forward in. And I think that, there's still a way where we can have a win-win. I think by electing President Barack Obama and people coming out to support him, I think people want to have more of a bipartisan effort, want more of their issues in the forefront and not the political battle that's taking place in Congress. So I think there is an opportunity for a win-win. We know that President Obama is looking at the 250,000, taxing over 250,000. The Republicans are coming out and saying if we go to 500,000, maybe that's something we could look at and we would be able to support something instead of going over the cliff. So I think there is always a place for win-win. It's just making sure that the people are around the table, that they really want to work out a deal and do the right thing for the American people. And I think when you have conversations taking place internally and another group goes and hold a press conference, that's not necessarily helpful. And so it's how do we bring everyone back to the table to really focus on getting the job done before December 31st. And so again, I think there could be a win-win.
Yeah, and I'm not somebody that believes in win-wins. I think that's just language that we use. I think in almost any negotiation, there's a loser and there's a winner, and you want to be the winner and let the loser believe that it's been a win-win, right?
Oh, wait a minute.
So, I'm sorry, that's just how it is. I think win-wins are largely fictional. So the reason we're in this position, we keep kicking the can down the road. The super committee, which was in place a year ago, had this terrible pill. It was supposed to be so bitter that there was no way they weren't going to come up with an agreement. This terrible thing is actually what we're confronting right now. And with the sequestration, the 10-year, $1.2 trillion budget cuts, and it was supposed to be equally onerous. So 50% comes out of the defense. We haven't had anyone up here from the defense, but boy, they're not happy about all this. And then 50% out of domestic discretionary. That was supposed to be so onerous that they were going to get a deal done. And the Democrats couldn't peel one Republican vote away, and the Republicans couldn't peel one Democrat vote away. And so we're facing this. I don't think we have the political mechanism to handle this in any kind of meaningful way. And I think they're going to have to come up with sort of a new approach. My hope would be that they would give this to a body outside of Congress. The closest we've seen was the BRAC commissions, the base realignment commissions, that then went back to Congress with a straight up or down vote, couldn't be amended. Simpson-Bowles, as it was originally designed, would have also come back with a straight up or down vote on amendable. The Congress is probably so broken now that they can't solve this in a meaningful way with any kind of long-term impact. I think they're going to have to reach out to an outside body and tie their hands so that they're going to have to. The Congress is going to have to tie their own hands and say we're going to let some kind of panel outside decide what the hell we should do, and then have a straight up or down vote. And if that can't pass, I don't know what in the world we do. We shut the federal government down and let state and local run it all.
I actually got to challenge you on if there's a winner, there has to be a loser thing, because I think that is a lot having to do with gender. I look at it like a mother. When my kids fought over a toy, I took it away and made them both unhappy.
Yeah.
And they weren't behaving.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so I think that this notion of winners and losers, and I think it's the arrogance of elected office too, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. You think if you get 51%, you mean that the majority of people like you. No, it meant at least some of those people voted for you because you weren't the other guy. So I always think you only really got half of the 51% because probably half of them just hated the other person more. So I think if we get rid of the arrogance of, I won, therefore everybody must think I'm right, I say if they can't balance the budget, we recall every single one of them sons of bitches. Every single one of them. They're failing to do their job. If we were employees and we overspent in our work, we'd get fired. So I think that the fact that they're not subject to common sense like all of the rest of us that have to live with the consequences, we need to take back our government. Period.
Good.
All right, thanks. Got that
Thanks,
off my
Mr.
chest.
King. Tim Yeomans. Tim Yeomans. I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. Along the lines of politics and votes, so let's say we go over the fiscal cliff, and as you predicted, and the new Congress has to deal with this. Is there any hope that on the first day of Congress, the Senate can resolve its embedded barrier of a one-senator block of anything, or the 60-vote pay-goat rule? And will they be able to, is there any chance of them changing their own rules on day one of the new Senate convening?
I had a conversation with a student today who corrected my interpretation of the Senate rules. And so now I'm not so confident I can even answer that question. The Senate does have the opportunity to replace its rules every 2 years. It's one of the first things that they will do. They will do it on the first day. But apparently not all of their rules are replaced. Some of their rules automatically roll forward from the previous sessions, one of which is Rule 5 that covers how filibusters are being done. So filibusters are being debated this week in the Senate as to whether or not they're going to change it in advance. If they change it now, then it'll be in place for the next Congress. It doesn't look very likely that they're going to modify their filibuster rules, although it certainly has been debated over it was very much in play over the weekend. And as I told my class today, I have a Twitter feed that comes straight from Capitol Hill, where it's just blowing up with talk about whether or not they're going to get rid of the filibuster. I think they have to do it. I don't think they will.
Hi, my name's Melissa Threadgill, and I'm MPP1 and former Massachusetts state employee. So I really appreciate you guys being here because I know how busy you are right now.
Where did you work for the state?
Massachusetts State Senate. So my question is a little bit bigger picture. You've got a room here full of people that would like to be, if not literally in your shoes, in shoes much like yours someday in the future. What advice do you have for us? How do you approach a problem like this? What do you think about? How do you plan in the face of really deep uncertainty and problems not of your own making? And I'll address it to anyone who thinks they have good advice to share.
Go ahead. Anyone?
It's conservative. I mean, you have to be. You're a little high in expenses, a little light on revenue, so you got some wiggle room on both sides. I mean, it's responsible.
For us, it's leadership. The mayor sets the tone, and one of our exercises is always to talk about impact, talk about people. Because if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Government is about helping people, and if you're not helping people, you're not doing your job, and that's what the mayor says to us. So when there's a crisis, we run every city department. We say, what does a cut mean to you? What does this crisis mean to you? How many less people can you serve? And you have to tell that story, and we do it through national organizations like the Conference of Mayors. We do it with our Boston delegation. I'm really blessed to have a great Boston delegation at the State House that we work with every day, because we've got 20, we've got a good group of them, but it's really about spreading the message and having that leadership to either say this is something we want or this is something we don't want. But when you work in government, you are fortunate enough to realize there's so many people who are experts in their field and can really help you understand what their agencies do and who they touch. So we're really about talking about who we touch and how we serve them and what the impacts would be positively or negatively based on this action.
I think to some degree, as you're dealing with the immediate crisis, which continually comes up, you have to find some way to have at least some people in leadership focused on and staying disciplined to looking at things in terms of efficiencies, creative approaches, it's really hard to do because those take investments, whether it's in developing those or putting the resources to them, that as you're faced with a crisis, sometimes can be the first thing off the plate. So if you can maintain that and then try to focus on the most critical resources. And to the degree you can get flexibility in doing that, that's one of the biggest challenges with the way things are funded is, we have a fair number of restrictions on a lot of the money that we receive and, having to go where the money takes us.
Thank you, Melissa. I think that's where we're going to have to end with the final questions. I'd like to conclude with something that's related to Melissa's question. That is, if you want to sit in these chairs and have similar jobs in the future, I think that's something that this PIC ought to be involved in. Let's network with our alumni who have these fabulous jobs and ask them to mentor us so that you can maybe have it a little easier to find those jobs. We're going to be presenting next year at ICMA. Their big annual conference will be here in Boston. That's the International City County Managers Association. If you'd like a job, there are city manager jobs out there. They're hard jobs, but they're the perfect kinds of jobs for people who have been trained here at the Kennedy School. I see Jim Montgomery in the back of the room, and I saw Jim last at the National League of Cities meeting. It was here in Boston. Was it this? That was last week, right? So there are professional associations out there and a tremendous alumni network that it's about time we start to invigorate. And I hope that the students who are in here can, a year from now, look back and say, I got a great job, not at the UN, but at the local level where I can make a difference. Thank you so much, Alvin. Thank you to our panelists, and we're going to give Alvin the last word.
So please join me in thanking our moderator and all of our great panelists for tonight. It's great to see you all here. We're really excited with the turnout for this, our first event of the Result Governance PIC. So thank you all for coming. My name is Alvin Warren. I am the chair of the Result Governance PIC. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, and I'm a member of the mid-career MPA class of 2013. Tonight we have the opportunity to hear from this really phenomenal panel of experts about the looming fiscal cliff. And I know everybody in this room has been watching on the news and hearing on the radio and hearing conversations and seeing this over social media. This is one of the most pressing challenges facing the United States, and as we all know, it has implications for the globe as a whole. And while this topic is all over the news, we actually don't really hear very much about how these tax increases and budget cuts, which by one estimate are going to cause deep automatic cuts in at least 1,000 different governmental programs, how these are going to impact state, tribal, and city governments, and also how it's going to impact the resources and the services that their constituents depend upon. This challenge illustrates perfectly why a group of us over the summer decided to form the Kennedy School's first student organization, professional interest council focused on state, tribal, and local governments. In our experience, it's these levels of government that have the most direct and immediate impact on people's lives, and also that provide great opportunities for innovation. So through this PIC, one of the things that we do hope to do is to draw and create greater emphasis on this area of governance, and particularly on encouraging the Kennedy School to better prepare and support public leaders to serve in these capacities. Now, first, I want to thank all of my colleagues here, and I'm going to do this with all the members of our PIC. Please stand, just so they can get recognized. You each get an additional pretzel. They'll be coming up in a little while. I want to thank you all for your hard work in creating the PIC and for organizing this great event. Since we set out to create this group, we've been fortunate to have the support of several of the centers here on campus, and they are also our co-sponsors for this first event. So I want to publicly recognize the Center for Public Leadership, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, the Rappaport.
How long this new budget agreement actually lasts. Whether we go off the fiscal cliff or not, as the year turns, state, local, tribal governments are in tremendous fiscal disrepair. It's a very hard environment. The money is going away, most likely, and certainly the powers and authority of the national government, much of that is devolving to local control. So the hard work of government is being done. Much of the hard work of government is being done in your counties, in your cities, in the tribal governments. And it's going to be an ever harder job, even if we manage to somehow avoid this fiscal cliff. You have a terrific panel here today, and we're going to go in order that they're sitting to my left. Professor Vilmus is going to have to leave at 5:30, so we want to get her in as quickly as humanly possible. I'd like to introduce in this order. Professor Vilmus is the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer here at the school. She's been with us for a good long time, having come out of the Clinton White House, where she served as Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Commerce. She also ran the census, the entire census in 2000, which is pretty remarkable. She's currently on the U.S. National Park System Board and U.S. Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Advisory Board. She's written numerous books, including the bestseller, The $3 Trillion War, which is the true cost of the Iraq conflict. Linda Forey is also familiar to many of you in the room. She represents the Commonwealth's 12th Suffolk District, including parts of Boston and Milton. And more familiar to most of you is that Linda is currently a master's degree candidate here at the Kennedy School. She chairs the House Joint Committee on Community Development and Small Business for the Massachusetts Legislature. So she has been central in spearheading major statewide initiatives to lower healthcare costs and increase capital for small businesses. Fascinating and helpful here today. Gary Moran, also no shrinking violence, certainly known around the halls of the Kennedy School, whether he wants to know it or not. He's the Senior Deputy Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, where he oversees compliance and enforcement activities agency-wide, and oversees mass DEP operations and
Institute of Greater Boston and the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. We really do appreciate their support for us and for this event. We also want to thank each of our panelists. They have come from near and far. Is that you, Karen?
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
So we've had some folks come from, downstairs. And then we've had somebody come all the way from Minnesota despite fog on the runway, and you got here. Thank you for coming. Welcome. So we really do thank you for taking your valuable time to share your insights and your recommendations with us. Finally, we've been very lucky to have the strong support of one individual in particular, and he is sitting to my left, Professor David King, who we are honored to have moderate this panel. Professor King is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also the faculty chair of the MPA programs. He chairs Harvard's program for newly elected members of the U.S. Congress, and he also chairs Harvard's executive program for leaders in state and local government. He joined the faculty in 1992 and lectures on legislatures, political parties, and interest groups. He has been an absolute force in helping us to create this pick, so please join me in thanking and welcoming Professor King.
Well, it's about time that we had a group around here paying attention to state, tribal, and local groups. And thank you for creating this pick, and it is going to be around for a very long time. Thank you for everyone who is coming in out of your time. There's so much going on in Cambridge these days, and we're very glad that you've chosen this time. It's really a crucial moment in Washington. Of course, we always say that, but this time it is absolutely crucial. We're in the crunch of this 6-week lame duck session, and a lot of work needs to get done during the lame duck session. The session began on November 13th. On December 31st, 4 things happened. The Bush-era tax cuts expire. All emergency unemployment benefits end. The payroll tax holiday will end. and the alternative minimum tax exemptions will end. Lame duck again ends on the 1st of January, and when you wake up on the 2nd of January 2013, the sequestration takes effect. It's $55 billion in mandatory cuts in defense spending and $55 billion in mandatory cuts for non-defense spending. Over the 10-year period, this is supposed to save us $1.2 trillion. It may or may not. We'll see. Professor Belmas.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. I just want to say to the students who've organized this area, congratulations. This is long overdue, but it's terrific to have some focus on state and local issues here, to have more focus on this area. And I find that in teaching budgeting and public finance, of course, many of the issues that we are dealing with are global issues, really. I mean, you have very similar issues anywhere in the world if you're dealing with traffic or recycling or bicycling or laying of cable or figuring out how to provide services. And so I congratulate you on that. There is a lot that you will hear about this so-called fiscal cliff and so on and so forth. But let me just step back for a minute, because there are many people who could talk to you about those ins and outs of those particular issues, and point out that the most salient feature of this particular fiscal cliff is that this is the umpteenth fiscal crisis we have had in the past few years. We are just lurching from one crisis to another, whether it was the business over the debt ceiling last year, or the threat to shut down the government the year before, or the threat to shut down the government the year before that. It has been going on and getting worse and worse and worse over the past few years, to the point where our budgeting system as a nation has become completely dysfunctional. And among the many, I think that is pretty obvious to everyone, but one of the proof of this dysfunctionality is that the vast majority of our spending now is appropriated through so-called continuing resolutions, which are stopgap measures. And it's as if you played a whole ball game by punting, 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 and punting. I mean, you would still be in the first inning, and that's where kind of we are. But more perniciously, if that's a word, the fact is that we actually we really don't have any control over what is happening, because the spending is being cobbled together in this series of Band-Aids. So let me give you a very brief summary of what I am touting at the moment, which is my proposal for how to remedy and fix the dysfunctional budget system, and what the impact and consequences would be of that on state and local
field activities in the agencies for regional offices. An area that many of you all, especially environmental policy students here, have tremendous interest in. Then Jake Sullivan, a man of Boston, the Chief of Staff and Federal Relations for Boston Mayor Thomas Menino. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Some of them he presumably buried himself. And it'll be interesting to hear his perspective on how the Menino administration, how the city of Boston can survive in the rarefied air where there's just not much money coming in anymore. And joining us from Minnesota is Karen Diver. She's the chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and she's serving as the chair of the tribal governance and the CEO of the reservation's corporate and economic development boards. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. She was a Bush Leadership Fellow, which is a special program for our fellows from Minnesota, in 2002, and it's wonderful to have her back on board with us as well. I'm about to pass off this microphone to Linda, but as somebody who studies Congress, that's the main area I do is Congress, these are really crunch days. The way that money is given out through Congress is a two-step process. First, there has to be authorizing legislation. There has to be a committee that says, this is how much we are going to spend. Authorizing bills usually last for a limited amount of period. For example, MAP 21 was the authorizing legislation for all of our highway transportation bills. It's a huge bill. It passed last June 6th. But it's only a 2-year authorization. Pay attention to what authorizations are coming up. And in terms of our interests in this room, there are several that are coming up quickly. I just looked on the list. I was surprised to see that the Workplace Investment Act is up for reauthorization in 2013. And of more concern, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is also up for reauthorization in 2013. If they aren't reauthorized, the money is not going to be released unless there's an agreement under continuing resolutions. So specifically with elementary and secondary education money, chopping block, they're in some real trouble. We have to get these issues solved, or at least cope with the consequences. Please help me welcome our entire panel. And